comedic relief. We're going to see the birth of a son that has been prayed about and longed for so long. But then we're also going to witness him send away one of his own sons. And that is truly no laughing matter. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 21 and let's read together Genesis chapter 21. I am going to read from the Legacy Standard Bible. Now Yahweh, the Lord, visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in jest, or in some of your translations will say mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son. The son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. And the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. So God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and your maidservant. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice. For through Isaac your seed shall be named. And of the son of the maidservant I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the child and sent her away. So she went and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was finished, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away, for she said, do not let me see when the child dies. And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Then God heard the voice of the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and was an archer. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. All right, let's stop there. One word. Wow. Let's look back at verse number 1. Now, we read from the LSB, but I also looked at this in the NIV. If we're following our SOAP study pattern, right, you start with a word-for-word translation like the LSB, and then you want to look at maybe a more thought-for-thought translation like the NIV. So if you have an NIV, you may have noticed a little different translation there in verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised." Now, looking back, as we first began to examine the lives of Abram and Sarai, we encountered a seemingly minor detail in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 30. Do you remember this? It says, "Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive." Now that brief little footnote built the tension that we've been exploring throughout this story, this narrative of Abraham and Sarai and their childlessness. And today marks the exciting resolution of that narrative, and what took us several weeks in this class to navigate through actually spanned a period of 25 years in Abraham and Sarah's lives. The question that comes to mind is, why did God make them wait so long? I believe the answer lies in God's intention to wait until their bodies were physically, reproductively dead before giving them their son. We learned a few weeks ago that Sarah, at the age of 90 years old, we saw pretty clearly that she was in a state of menopause. Abraham was as good as dead, right? Twice in our passage, even today, he's very old, and specifically being here in this passage, how old?
100 years.
100 years old. So they're both similarly beyond the age of reproduction. In modern terms, there were no more eggs to be fertilized, and there was no more fertilizer. But that's precisely the point. Do you understand that? This story isn't about Sarah birthing the baby that she was promised. The miracle was where? In the conception itself. Think about this. Through all these months, through all these years, they were physically unable to conceive on their own, right? This miraculous conception, does it make you think of another miraculous conception anywhere in Scripture? Yeah, does to me. That of Jesus through Mary. In both cases, listen carefully, in both cases, who brought about the birth? God did. Only God could do this, demonstrating His divine power and His purpose. Remember what He said. He said, "I alone have the power. I alone have the might. I alone have the authority." And you've got to understand, I'm stressing this because, remember, the first readers of this narrative, Hebrews, right? Hebrew people reading for the first time this narrative of Abraham and Sarah, they needed to understand that their nation wasn't merely chosen by God. No, it was created by God. The very existence of the Jewish people stands as a testimony to God's power and His authority. Isaac, the name Isaac means what? Laughter. So Isaac, whose name means laughter, was born. And Abraham faithfully followed God's commands by naming him as God had commanded him, and also obedient in performing circumcision on Abraham on what day? The 8th day. Now, I was doing some studying in preparing for this lesson. The practice of infant circumcision was unprecedented. Let me say that again. The practice of infant circumcision was unprecedented. However, I did find where the Egyptians practiced circumcision as a rite of passage during puberty. And that was the first recorded instance of, here anyway, of an 8-day-old baby being circumcised. Do I believe that some of Abram's servants and servant babies were circumcised before Abram? I do believe that. But this is the first time the Bible records an 8-day circumcision.
You keep saying Abram. It was Isaac that was circumcised, not Abraham.
Abraham performed the circumcision.
Oh, okay. But it sounded like you were saying.
No, Abraham performed the circumcision. Pretty radical act of obedience. So Abraham and Sarah laugh together as they hold this beautiful newborn baby boy, knowing that this child was not a work of the flesh, but what?
The Spirit.
A work of the Spirit, a work of God. However, their joy would soon be tempered by distress over Abraham's firstborn son named what? Ishmael. Look at that in verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in jest, or as the NIV says, saw the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, born to Abraham, was mocking. Now, I think it's worth noting that in the Middle East, at this particular time in history, mothers didn't typically wean their children until about the age of 3 years old. That means Ishmael, if that is correct, and this is what blows my mind as I study this narrative, if you're following the timeline, that would make Ishmael between 15 and 17 years old when this feast took place for Isaac. So Isaac, 3 years old, weaned. If that's when he was weaned, which was typical of the timeline, that would have put Ishmael between 15 and 17 years old, when that feast took place between 15 and 17 years old, guess what most 15 and 17-year-old boys at this particular point in time were getting ready to do? Marry. But for some reason, it's interesting the way Ishmael is presented here. The Hebrew term used for mocking, by the way, it shows that, I mean, this guy was doing something in perpetually bad taste. Whatever it was, whatever he was doing was in bad taste. And made me think, have you ever witnessed a mother's reaction when their child is mocked? Something just snaps inside of a mama. I mean, I'll never forget, I was about 7 years old, and one of my mother's brothers was making fun of my red hair. And I mean, I never saw my mom get mad at just about anything, but boy, she was pretty mad that day. My Uncle Junior, I thought my Uncle Junior was going to have to run. I mean, imagine Sarah's reaction after waiting nearly, 90 years for this child, whatever the case may be. What was Sarah's reaction? She wasn't going to have none of this. Look at verse 10. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son. What's she saying, class?
Get rid of them.
Get rid of them.
I want them in my sight.
She says, this son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. It really, I mean, it takes us back in the narrative. Haven't we kind of seen this before? They got into it before, right? And Sarai sent Hagar packing, right? So basically, Sarah demanded that Abraham get rid of this slave woman and her son. After 18 years, yeah.
Well, she had already done it once, and God brought him back.
Yeah, that's what I said. We're deja vu here, right?
Well, then, this is all because she suggested it.
Yep.
But she didn't like it.
Verse 11 tells us, though, that what is this doing to Abraham? It's tearing him up inside.
For 18 years he has done this.
I mean, if Ishmael's really 15 to 17 years old, do you think that Abraham and that son have had any bonding time? Surely. I don't think Abraham was cold and heartless toward Ishmael. I think he had love for him. What's that?
Maybe Sarah did.
Yeah. So, verse 11 says, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. We might be surprised to discover that Abraham's distress centered on sending away Ishmael, but should we really? I mean, again, as I said, he's been around this boy for at least 15 years. And in that culture, as I said, Ishmael would have been nearly of marriageable age. I think Abraham found himself caught between pleasing his wife and keeping his firstborn son. I think he's debating this internally. But God steps in, right? God eases the decision, saying in verse 12, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah, it's the first time I've heard this one. And this narrative is the first time we've heard God say, listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. There's a lot of obedience here in this chapter, in this short narrative. There's a lot of obedience. Naming, circumcising, and now sending away. Look at verse 14. Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food, got a skin of water, gives it to Hagar, and sent her away with her son. I tried to picture that in my mind. I wonder what that was like. Do you think Abraham hugged Ishmael? I think so. I think, though, once again, we're witnessing injustice here. Injustice done to Hagar. Did she ask for this situation? Not that we know of. I don't really believe she deserved this fate. Yet here she is again, wandering aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. Deja vu. Now, you think about it, Beersheba could support life, no doubt about it. But this was harsh terrain. that required careful planning and hard work to survive. And Hagar finds herself once again a single parent, alone, wandering aimlessly, forsaken by loved ones, and now she's run out of what? Water. Verse 15, when their water runs out, kind of lends the idea here that Ishmael has gotten weak, dehydrated. What's happening to her boy? What is she witnessing? He's dying. And so she places him under a bush where he has collapsed from dehydration. She goes, I love the way the Bible describes it, a bow shot away, because she could not bear to watch her son die. And so Ishmael is crying out, right? And she's crying too. But once again, we serve a God, as I told you weeks ago, we serve a God who, what? Hears. Which, by the way, the name Ishmael means what? A God who hears. So God hears their cries. I don't know if you know this or not, but it's rare in Scripture for someone to hear God's voice more than once in a direct way, much less to have His instructions save their life twice. But it's the case for Hagar and Ishmael. But here we find God speaking to Hagar again, and what does He say to her? He says those first words are what? What does He say? Do not fear, do not be afraid. God has heard what? What does it say? God has heard the boy crying. Lift him up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great... I mean, this is marvelous, folks. She puts him under that bush. She's expecting him to what? Die. Here he's, with whatever amount of strength he has left, is crying. And she is across the way, the bow shot away, and she's crying. Time is running out. And then she hears God's voice. And it's amazing what God says to her. You go take your boy up by the hand, because I'm not done yet. I'm going to make him into a great nation. And then comes to me what is a fascinating detail. In verse 19, what does it say? Then God opens her eyes. Now, wait a second. Let's look at this very carefully. Then God opens her eyes, and she sees a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy to drink. One has to wonder, was the well already there?
Didn't find it before.
She sure didn't find it before. Was it already there and she simply couldn't see it in her distress? Or is this a miracle of God? Their lives, folks, it's so amazing, this theme of water and salvation. Water and salvation. I love that. Oh, baptism, water, that doesn't have anything to do with salvation. Every time in Scripture, Old Testament, it's water and salvation. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21, right? Through water. 8 souls were saved by water. Here we've got a Hagar and Ishmael. They're going to be saved by what? By water. Verse 20 and 21. It's interesting how this timeline, like it seems like, I don't know, as I was studying this the other day and thinking about it, it's like, man, I want 21 to tell me a lot more detail. I want to see Isaac as a little boy and what did he get into as a little kid, and did Ishmael and Isaac, did they ever, did Ishmael ever hold Isaac, like what? But it just seems like the story just kind of jumps a little bit, right? So verse 20 and 21 jumps ahead. What does it tell us? So God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael went on to be a what? What's an archer? Bow and arrow, an archer. In the desert of Paran, says eventually marrying what? An Egyptian. Why an Egyptian, I wonder? Because Mama, Hagar, was an Egyptian. Where did she perhaps come from? Remember that old story in the narrative we looked at several weeks ago of Abraham passing off his wife as his sister, and then he ends up with a lot of what? A lot of servants, and part of them servants were Egyptian named Hagar. So eventually marrying an Egyptian woman, which I love the fact says chosen by his mama from her homeland.
When I read this with God was with the boy, it reminds me of Joseph when he went down to Egypt.
That's right.
God was with him right through his time in Egypt.
I think there is something to be said, and I think there's something very important to be said when anytime we read in the Old Testament and God was with. I think anytime we see that in our study of Genesis or other Old Testament books, anytime we see that phrase, there's something special going on. You might wonder, how does the author know what happened to Ishmael after he was sent away? You want to know the answer to that? Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. I'll give you spoilers. What happens in Genesis 25, buddy? Somebody dies. Abraham dies. And Abraham dies and he's how old? 175 years old. Guess who comes back together to bury their father? Isaac and Ishmael come back together to bury their father, showing that some form of communication had been maintained over the years. I tell you, as I was studying this, I kept thinking, man, I wish there was more. I wish there was more. I wish there was more. But then it hit me. I don't need more. God has told me everything I need to know. And there's some great lessons here. I mean, how do we interpret this as something that is important for us today? Or do we, that's just one of them stories. I love how sometimes we look at these, narratives in the Old Testament. Oh, it's just a good story. No, it's not just a good story. It's got some very valuable assets for us as Christians today. So I want to spend the time that we've got left this morning just talking together about some of the valuable lessons that we have learned from, say, Genesis chapter 11 and what we've witnessed all the way through Genesis chapter 20, these 25 plus years of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, now Isaac. What does it mean for us today? What did it mean for the early Christians who no doubt heard this narrative taught on many of occasions. So let me address this by giving you two major points this morning for our class. The first thing that really jumps off the page here is that this narrative of Isaac's birth should remind every single one of us that God is always reliable to keep His promises. Anybody ever had a promise broken to you? Raise your hand if you've ever had somebody break a promise. Have you ever broken a promise? God has never. And I also think it's important as a side note to relate to you that we as Christians, not only should we trust in God's promises, but here's the hard part. We got to learn to trust in God's timing. Notice how the passage began that we read together. It says what? The Lord was gracious to Sarah, and the Lord did for Sarah what He had promised. And then we read, Sarah bore a son to Abraham in his old age at what? What does it say? At the very time that God had promised him. God was faithful to keep His promise to Abraham and Sarah, but in His timing, not theirs. Six. Six more boys. No one could have predicted, though, no one could have predicted that Sarah was going to give birth to a child at the age of, 90. No one could have predicted that. Could you imagine them telling folks that? Could you imagine them walking around and go, yeah, God's promised we're going to have a son. And years start ticking by, those 25, and then folks are going, man, you've been talking about this for 20 plus years. I think you woo. Yeah, Sarah's going to have a child. Yep, and look at her. You can tell she's ready to have a child. Yeah, the laughing was very sincere, emotional reaction. Even more remarkably, by the way, is the fact that she was able to nurse Isaac for at least 3 years. So God did what to her body? Restored life. And later, as we just mentioned, Abraham would go on to have more children after Sarah died, living until, again, he was 175 years old. But again, I cannot say this enough. The Lord waited. He waited until their bodies were as good as dead, reproductively speaking, before bringing new life. Ensuring what? What is God ensuring? This is a theme throughout the Old Testament. Remember those walls? They marched around, they fell. Remember Gideon? All these times, there's a theme running through it. What is that theme? Do you know what it is?
God is in control.
That God is the one making this stuff happen, not man. It wasn't Abraham and Sarah working reproductively speaking to give the birth of Isaac. It was God making this happen through them. Of everything. Yes. Yeah, I've been working for the last Last month, I've been working on a lesson I'll preach probably sometime this year on providence, because I don't think it's something we truly understand well enough. And I personally have struggled to understand God's providence over the years. But He's still working. He's still working in our lives providentially in a great way.
One of the things that I have learned from that time to now, is that in that 25 years, God also increased Abraham's faithfulness and faith in him. He built that.
Yeah, God was preparing Abraham over these 25 years to be the father.
Father that he was supposed to be.
That's right. God was preparing this entire time to be the father that He needed him to be.
Excuse me. Thinking of Abraham's love for his son who he had to send away.
Yeah, Ishmael.
And looking at sending him just with the mother and nothing.
Yeah.
I was wondering, why didn't he send like some?
Why did He not send him a more?
Yes, and more.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, that keeps,
Yeah, it definitely, as I've read this a umpteen dozen times, I kept wondering, well, why didn't He send him with, because Abraham had plenty.
Yes, and he loved his son.
And he loved him. I don't know if there's maybe a part of the narrative that we're not given here. I don't know.
Or probably that happened, and then when Hagar cried out and God listened to her, probably that was the forerunner. But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
Have yourself thinking about it.
Another thought here. I don't know about you, but I'm not the most patient person in the world. Waiting is difficult. 25 years proved too long for Abraham and Sarah, tempting them to get ahead of God and try to bring about His promise through what? Their own efforts. And, well, we struggle with that same impatience today. I remember during college, I had Brother Eddie Bull, who was one of the elders at the Midway Church of Christ where I grew up. Brother Eddie came up to me, and 17 years old, and he said, "Jonathan, you want to be a preacher, right?" "Yes, sir, I do." He goes, "Have you ever thought about going to," at that time, International Bible College? I said, "Well, I've talked about IBC, I've talked about Freed Hardeman, I've talked about Harding, I've talked about Faulkner, but man, I don't really know what to do." I said, "I want to preach right now." I said, "I don't want to just wait. I want to be preaching right now." And he said, "Well, the Manchester Church of Christ, they don't have a preacher. Their preacher, Brother Anderson, is retiring." And he said, "Why don't you go there and preach for them?" And he said, Brother Anderson will be there and be a good mentor to you. So I get there, and I'm learning about ministry, and I'm eager. I have this mentality. I think I'm sent there to fix the church. It's funny that God's first assignment for me as a minister was a small, dying church in the middle of Walker County, Alabama, that I couldn't fix. But there, I learned some crucial lessons about loving people. And I tell you what I really learned is that a small group of the Lord's church could support a young minister more than I supported them. I learned there is no such thing as getting ahead of God's timing. I mean, had to learn a lot of patience. Still do. Just as God used Abraham and Sarah's fleshly mistake to teach the church a lesson, He used my impatience to teach me a lesson. I think the early church also learned that God's promises are irreconcilable with the flesh. He said, "Jonathan, what do you mean?" Well, this narrative represents more than just sibling rivalry. It portrays two incompatible ways of approaching God. Isaac represented faith. Ishmael represented flesh. Isaac represented promise. Ishmael represented performance. The early church learned this interpretation from the Apostle Paul in his missionary journey to the Galatians. Some background if you want to hear it. Paul's custom was to first preach in synagogues to Jews and then to Gentiles. But when he gets to Galatia, he encountered cities that didn't have enough Jewish presence, so there wasn't a synagogue. And so Paul would boldly go into these Gentile communities and preach where there was very little, if any, Jewish influence. And when word reached Jerusalem, guess what happened? Jerusalem's going to send these Judaizers to Galatia, claiming that Paul's gospel was incomplete. These Gentiles needed what? Got to be circumcised in order to be right with God. And can we blame the Judaizers? I mean, Jesus was a Jew. He practiced circumcision, and God gave this Jewish nation circumcision as a covenant sign. Naturally, they concluded salvation required Jesus plus something. But is that true? Is it Jesus plus something? No. No, it's just Jesus. And the issue in Galatia wasn't whether Gentiles could be saved. It was whether they could be saved without circumcision. The Judaizers pointed to Abraham to make their case, but they didn't really realize. You don't argue Old Testament with the Apostle Paul because he's pretty wise in that Old Testament. And Paul brilliantly responded. He's basically saying, you think the issue is who's your daddy, Abraham? The question is not who's your daddy. The question is who's your mama. See, look at this, Galatians 4:21. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of the Spirit, the divine promise. And Paul is explaining these things figuratively. The women represent two covenants. Hagar represented Mount Sinai, corresponding to the present-day Jerusalem in slavery with her children. But the real Jerusalem, which we're a part of, is free. And you know, when you look back at this, these two covenants, these two approaches to God are absolutely irreconcilable. They cannot coexist. The born of the flesh represents those who place their hope in keeping the law and what they can do. They think that can make them right with God, but that never works and never has. All right, any questions before we close up this section? Now, next Lord's Day morning, we're going to pick up in the middle section of this chapter in Genesis chapter 21. We're going to go back and see Mr. Abimelech come back on the scene, or at least the title anyway, and verse 22. So we'll pick back up there next Lord's Day morning. Any questions before we close up?
Just a teaser. Galatians is the only book that Paul did not greet them as he usually does.
That's right. Galatians is the only book they didn't start with that customary greeting. Yes, ma'am. Phil.
You know, it just has finally occurred to me that when Jesus talks about the fact that God could have created Abraham's, offspring out of these stones. It just registered with me that everything in here was, we know that it's God's providence, but it is His absolute, unchangeable will. Jesus is telling us, don't look at any of this history, nation of Israel, and believe that you are just this natural.
Yeah, don't believe that you and your celebration of yourselves is what got you into this situation. It's always been about God and what He was doing, right? Yeah, I love it. Any other comments or questions?
Don't forget to announce.
Yeah, that's what I was about to do. All right, don't forget what our shepherd said this morning about Wednesday. I'm sure they'll let you know. Okay, it is canceled, so no Wednesday night Bible study. Also that morning, there will be no ladies' Bible class. No ladies' Bible class. It normally meets at 10 a.m. On Wednesday morning. The offices will most likely be closed Tuesday and Wednesday. If you have any concerns that you need to call us on, I'll try to forward the phone calls to either my cell phone or one of the other office staff so you can still get in touch with us. If you've got any emergency issues, you can also email us as well. Please be safe. We'll be back at 6 p.m. tonight. Listen, I shared with the elders this morning, I originally intended to begin a two-part series on instrumental music tonight. But with the number of people that are probably going to be unable to be, I'm going to do a little bit different thing tonight. We know we've been doing this question and answer series from time to time on Sunday night. I've got 5 questions that I think I'm going to tackle tonight, and I've got some good ones that people have given us. So at 6 p.m. tonight, we'll be back together. Bundle up tight, stay warm, and we'll see you tonight if you can be back with us at all possible. Love you. Please be safe.